So I'm the program manager for the Kootenay Conservation Program, and I so appreciate having you all here from local government. As Derek said, this is a different realm than the traditional conservation community to some degree. Of course, there's overlap there. So I wanted to talk about setting the context for why conservation is important to local governments and how it may relate to local government work, a little more about Kootenay Conservation Program, and then our agenda today. So it's interesting because the Real Estate Foundation of BC did that survey all across BC about values of citizens that Ramona shared the results from. And KCP has done a similar survey in 2006, 2012, and just in November of 2018 to find out what residents here value. And one of the top values of residents is fish and wildlife habitat, water and aquatic systems, and open space and farmland. So it's what contributes to people's quality of life and the Kootenay way of life and why they live here. So in this 2018 survey, I promised to share the results for the first time, so they're hot off the press. And this is what your constituents and residents value. So when asked an open-ended question of what elements contribute to your quality of life, elements that relate to the environment were within the top 50%. So 1 in 2 people mentioned something to do with the environment as their #1 top quality of why they live here. Then, so how does that relate to private land and conservation? We know we have large tracts of wilderness. It's what's beautiful about the Kootenays. Private land and valley bottoms really contribute importantly to conservation. So for example, as Dr. Michael Proctor will be talking about later this morning, valley bottoms provide corridors for large ranging wildlife. So if we want to maintain species like grizzly bears and wolverines, we need these large tracts of habitat connected, and valley bottoms through private land do that. As well, private lands have a disproportionate amount of rare ecosystems compared to upland areas. So for example, private lands in the Kootenays are about 8% of the land base, and yet they contain 26% of wetlands, about 27% of dry forest ponderosa pine, 31% of dry Douglas fir forest. So these are these open grassland dry forests that are really important for species at risk. And an analysis that was done by Ministry of Environment looked at the number of species at risk occurrences on private land in BC and found between the RDEK and RDCK, 86% of species at risk occurrences are on those 8% of private lands. So species like the skink, western skink, the blue-tailed lizard we see around, those little purple dots you see is where skink occurrences have been documented. And when we compare that to where the private land is, you'll see it's almost a complete overlap. So unless we have private land stewardship of skinks, we won't be stewarding their habitat. In the East Kootenay, same with the badgers. So the green zone is where badgers live, overlapped with the private land. You can see the importance of these valley bottoms. And in the context of climate change, which I know is a concern to residents as well as local governments looking to the future, connecting ecologically to allow species to move through habitats as they adapt and shift northward is going to be very important to maintaining ecosystem resilience. Many of the threats we see too in the Kootenays are really focused on private land. As Nancy Newhouse puts it, we want to live where animals want to live. So what animals consider riparian habitat, we consider a waterfront property. So a lot of these threats to wetlands and private lands are concentrated in valley bottoms. So in that 2018 survey, people were asked, how concerned are you about the following issues on a scale of 1 to 7, 7 being the most concerned, 1 being not at all concerned. So answers of 5, 6, or 7 are there in red as concerned. 80% of residents are concerned about the loss or extinction of fish and wildlife species in the Kootenays. And after that is the safety of drinking water, climate change, locally grown food products, and controlling invasive plants. So these are what your constituents say they are concerned about here. Another question that was asked is, Do you agree or disagree strongly or not with the statement, land use regulations on private land to manage future development are needed, even if it means more restrictions being placed on the use of your own property? And you'll see that 53% of residents agree with that statement. So we see that private land conservation is extremely important. And in 2002, a number of organizations were really concerned with development in the East Kootenay. So they formed this partnership because there's no one agency responsible for private land conservation. So it's easy for it to fall through the cracks. So the Kootenay Conservation Program was formed with the mandate to coordinate and facilitate conservation efforts on private land and to generate the resources needed to maintain this effort. So that's what our focus is, as Derek explained. We don't actually do conservation work, we just facilitate organizations to work collaboratively together. We have 88 organizations currently in the partnership, and we would love to have local governments officially sign on through our charter, and I'd be happy to share that with you. We work towards our mandate in 4 priority areas, as Derek mentioned, and those are on the table: securement, stewardship, capacity building, and serving as a network. So with securement, we try and coordinate between the land trusts, and we have 2 land trusts represented here today who actually acquire private land for conservation purposes or put covenants on land for that purpose. And one of the questions people say is, well, we've got lots of parks and protected areas in the Kootenays, isn't that enough? But if you look at where parks and protected areas are, they're generally at high elevations. Here's a map of ecosystems. So the yellow and orange represents the dry forest and grasslands. And you can see where the protection of those ecosystems is down at around 5 or 6%, well below the target of 17% in Canada or 20%. So there's an underrepresentation of protecting those ecosystems, and that's where land trusts play a strong role. Another goal we focus on is stewardship, and many of our partner organizations promote and do stewardship work in the area, and some of them have display booths here today, and they use a number of tools in the toolbox for that. We have 4 strategic priorities around stewardship, and as Derek mentioned, number 4, which is the one we haven't really delved too far into because we're looking for your input on this, is support local governments to incorporate and apply conservation principles into local land use planning. So how do we do that? What are the tools and options available? How much is local government responsibility? How much is not? And this is where some of the expertise shared today will help with that question, and from you, what you're focusing on or issues and concerns you have will really help guide that conversation. Another question in the survey was, local and regional governments should do much more to conserve wildlife and their habitats on private land, and 71% of residents agreed with that statement. The third goal we focus on is capacity building. So we try and build knowledge capacity, technical capacity, so having speakers and opportunities to share knowledge and skills, as well as financial capacity, and that's a big role that local governments here have played with the local conservation funds. We'll specifically talk about that today. And finally, we serve as a network. So we're so excited to have you here joining in today, and we do provide the opportunity to connect with people regularly throughout the year. So we're going to touch on a few things today. We've got Deb Curran from University of Victoria to talk about regulatory tools for conservation. What kind of options are there for bylaws or official community plans or development permit areas, and how have they been used in BC, or could they be used for conservation? We know that wildlife traveling through private land requires a multitude of jurisdictions for a grizzly bear to pass through, for example. So how do you do multi-jurisdictional corridors? How do those get incorporated? So we're going to hear from Scott Boswell from the Okanagan, who's done that type of work with local governments, and then Michael Proctor will share where those really important corridors are in the Kootenays. We'll explain a bit about local conservation funds and exciting opportunities to expand those, and then really focus after lunch on hearing from you. How do we move forward? How can we support you in your activities? At the end of the day, we'll get an update from Lynn Campbell, who's with the Species and Ecosystems at Risk Local Government Working Group. So there's local government representatives all over BC battling with the same kind of issues and with the same interests, so staying connected to them. And then at the end of the day, we'll also showcase some local resources that you can bring back to your offices and be aware of. And then a raffle at the end of the day, just to keep you here. So again, thank you to our event sponsors.